begin the discussion if Dr. Chismar would begin.
Thank you. Mr. White warned me that if we didn't say things that stimulated discussion, he would switch the TV on and put on the equalizer or something like that. So I have written up my remarks in order that they might be directed to certain, I think, very controversial issues. My remarks will also be directed primarily toward Dr. Russell Kirk's address, which was the most philosophical of the three addresses. In his address, Politics and Religion, Society's Imperative, Dr. Russell Kirk asks the question, is there such a thing as a Christian polity? That is, does Christian doctrine prescribe some especial form of politics and conformity by all communicants to that political model? In response to this question, Dr. Kirk considers and rejects two opposing positions. The first position for consideration holds that, in fact, it is the Church's task to prescribe particular economic and political policies. Dr. Kirk cites as an example the 1984 issuance by the United Methodist Church's General Board of Church and Society of a pre-election scorecard advocating positions on such issues as the exploitation of women in the economy, the Pershing II missile, South African investments, the United Nations Law of the Sea Treaty, and so forth. Dr. Kirk warns that religious communions may be deafened by this kind of, quote, fife and drum ecclesiastic, unquote, and constructs a series of arguments and illustrations against such direct participation in the political process by the Church. Several arguments are contained, for example, in the following excerpt. This is Dr. Kirk. Now, I am not aware that the Bible is addressed to such prudential questions of the 20th century, nor that John Wesley or any other early light of Methodism intended to create a dogmatic political ideology by which Christians ought to be bound. Christ came to save sinners, not to rule the kingdoms of the earth. Christian teaching, like Jewish teaching, is intended to govern the soul, not the state. Overall, Dr. Kirk's problem with the fife and drum ecclesiastic model is that it draws religious leaders beyond the scope of revealed truth and hence beyond their area of proper knowledge and expertise. Dr. Kirk offers a series of examples of what happens when ecclesiastical leaders attempt to address prudential concerns. It's no coincidence that all of his examples are of churches which adopt liberal political viewpoints. Thus, Harvey Cox's views are strongly criticized, while Jerry Falwell's name is not mentioned. A second position criticized by Dr. Kirk is the attempt to subordinate religious ends to political ends. Like all the speakers in this series, Dr. Kirk is greatly concerned about the virtual abolition of religion in public circles in the name of the First Amendment and the doctrine of church-state separation. Quote, there is something worse even than that entanglement of religion and politics, unquote, he holds. I mean total separation of religion from the civil social order, so that, in the phrase of Dr. Philip Phoenix, church and state would rot separately in separate tombs. Dr. Kirk holds that all culture arises in the beginning from the religious cult. I think these remarks were in the taped excerpt we just saw. He suggests that without Christian culture and Christian hope, the modern world would come to resemble a half-derelict fun fair, gone nasty and poverty-racked, life a gamble at best, one enormous Atlantic city. Religious concepts about order and justice provide the foundations for the American political system. Religious dogma offers a necessary moral restraint to the policies and ambitions of men. And he quotes T.S. Eliot, who said, if you will not have God, and he is a jealous God, you should pay your respects to Hitler or Stalin. Dr. Kirk is especially critical of idealistic political ideologies which seek to provide an earthly substitute for religion. Such attempts, he argues, lead only to an earthly hell. Okay, now we come to Dr. Kirk's solution. If Dr. Kirk is thus opposed to these two terrible simplifiers, how does he propose that religion and politics interact? The tenuous balance which he seeks to maintain is, as one might expect, wrapped up in Dr. Kirk's own politically conservative viewpoint. Dr. Kirk holds that there are three ways in which religious, specifically Christian belief, may have influence upon politics. By giving hope to statesmen, by providing an impetus for renewal in the minds and hearts of the people, and by firming up the moral norms which lie behind our political system. People who trust in a big God don't need to establish big government. Belief in a transcendent being and a heavenly paradise vitiates the tendency to believe in earthly political system and seek a terrestrial paradise. As a conservative, Dr. Chruch applauds any religious influence which will shift power and attention away from government to some transcendent sphere, with the net result that government leaves people alone. The connection, of course, is quite indirect. It is doubtful if an increase in church attendance can be counted on to bring the tax rate down. By way of critique, Dr. Chruch's views are ideally suited for a 45-minute speech. As long as he doesn't have to provide any details concerning the implementation of his views, he should have no problem maintaining the careful balance between the two positions he describes. It is when we think about practical implementation that things become a little shaky. What Dr. Chruch seems to be saying is that the public sphere needs a little religion to make our leaders better people, so that then, out of a good heart, they can use their secular training and expertise to make moral decisions. This is something like saying that we ought to send our state Supreme Court justices to charm school so that they won't argue with each other so much. If Dr. Chruch wants religion to have any more than a charm school influence on public affairs, he may have to let a few church leaders in the State House door, at least into the hearing rooms. It seems self-frustrating to expect our religious leaders to strengthen the moral backbone of our country without allowing them to make a few practical applications of morality to public affairs. And if they haven't done a good job of talking about public affairs in the past, maybe they need a little better education and training rather than excluding them from that sphere. But there's one other, even more serious problem which Dr. Chruch and also the two other speakers entirely overlook. And it's this question: is the contemporary church, in fact, in any condition to help straighten out government or public affairs? Or is it caught in many of the same dilemmas as those besetting political leaders? In a recent book, Alistair McIntyre has diagnosed the way in which, in our society, many institutions have become divorced from any kind of context or shared community which would make sense of such things as moral norms. McIntyre argues that, quote, modern moral utterance and practice can only be understood as a series of fragmented survivals from an older past, unquote. The result is a train of seemingly insoluble moral problems and indeterminable moral conflicts. This is typified, I think, by the Phil Donahue show, where everybody argues, but no one's ever expected to come up with any answers or to agree with each other. In contemporary society, we have lost the kind of community bondedness and the respected social roles which once gave people a context within which to distinguish between good and bad. A consumer society made up of atomistic individuals who compete to use up scarce resources and the last vestiges of nature have little ability to make qualitative evaluations of what is right and wrong. Such a society is, as T.S. Eliot suggested, a wasteland. And in this present wasteland, we find not only the Congress or the Supreme Court, but many religious institutions as well. So, bring religion into politics, keep it out. What's the difference if both representatives of contemporary society are equally bewildered? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, to proceed with our discussion.
Mr. Moderator, thank you. After listening to you speak and talk with us at the dinner hour, I'd be willing to volunteer to relinquish my time and listen to you. You know so much about politics. On the other hand, that would probably make it impossible to justify the Ashbrook Center sending a private railroad car to bring me here from Washington, D.C., so I really ought to speak. Delighted to speak from an evangelical perspective in the light of Dr. Rice's approbation of Jeremy Rifkin's evaluation that the mushrooming evangelical growth that we are seeing in our country is the most significant cultural phenomenon in American life today. He wrote that in 1979. He might affirm it even now, and especially in the arena of politics, where evangelicals are regarded as culprits by some people. Evangelicals are involved because they're concerned about their nation. I know it's not an interrogatory sentence in the Declaration in the Gettysburg Address, But Abraham Lincoln posed a question there, whether that nation or any nation so conceived or so dedicated can long endure. If 200 years is long endurance, then the question has been answered, but Jean-Francois Revel, in his book How Democracies Perish, is evoking a lot of discussion even on Capitol Hill, and he suggests that Western democracies may soon become a footnote in world history. Should that happen, the demise of the United States as the primary model and perhaps the protector of such freedoms, that would be equivalent to the triumph of totalitarianism, with a most tragic result, the deprivation of the chief of human rights, religious liberty. So we are concerned about our nation. In that concern, it's rather remarkable that the Reverend Jerry Falwell, who seems ready to give the Pentagon any weapons system that it desires, and U.S. Senator Mark Hatfield, who is committed to a nuclear freeze or more in cutbacks in our defensive capability, who annually votes against the adoption of the Department of Defense budget as a matter of conviction, both evangelicals, though Falwell within the fundamentalist part of the right wing of evangelicalism, they concur with this sentence, that we have more to fear from the wrath of a holy God than from the Soviet Union. From an evangelical perspective, the question of whether our nation endures or not is a question of the judgment of the Lord of history, a holy and righteous God. And in that connection, sad to say, we have lost our moral consensus in the United States. Our founding fathers would have been brokenhearted to see that. In his farewell address in 1796, George Washington said, "Where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice? And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." Writing to his wife Abigail, John Adams, who became the first vice president and second president, said, "It is religion and morality alone which can establish principles upon which freedom can securely stand. A patriot must be a religious man." And in 1789, now vice president, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other." Thomas Jefferson showed that he was not a consistent deist, at least in this. He was not one who believed that a clockmaker kind of God set the universe there and wound it up and then left it to run down without any further involvement with it, when he said that he trembled for his nation when he remembered that God was just. And James Madison, author of the Bill of Rights in 1791, said, "Before any man can be considered as a member of civil society, he must be considered first as a subject of the governor of the universe." But so far from the conviction of our founding fathers, our first four presidents and many others of their day, so far are we from that D. James Kennedy described the current hostility between church and state and God and government in many quarters by suggesting that the hot air mass of Christianity has collided with the cold air mass of unbelief and produced a terrible storm front. And of course, you and I saw it manifested in the 1984 election at several levels. When we talk about the relation of religion and politics, I'd like to affirm Russell Kirk's observation that there's a good deal of ignorance involved, and mention the Phil Donahue Show, a theological forum of probably more impact upon the United States than the Evangelical Theological Society, sad to say. For I appeared on the Phil Donahue Show about 3 years ago to defend the President of the United States if he needed that, Jeb. You once were in the role of doing that. This was a little different. The President had made 30 and 60-second spots in support of the Layman's National Bible Week and urged people to read the Bible, which he called the Word of God, expressing his own interpretation of what that book is. And the ACLU types were charging him with doing something nefarious, certainly something totally and thoroughly improper for the President. About 3/4 of the way through the show, I blew the whistle interrupted as one must on the Donahue show, or else it just goes on by, and you wonder when it's over why you didn't have a chance to say anything. And observed that I had heard bandied about the term unconstitutional. 4 or 5 times the president had done something unconstitutional and suggested that Phil ought to press the other panelists to tell me from which part of the Constitution did they draw this conclusion. I assumed we were speaking of the First Amendment, which says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And I reminded everyone that this was Congress, not the president. We were speaking of laws, not public affairs announcements. And if that was an irrelevant text in the Constitution, just what part of it did he violate? And of course, there was no answer. There's a great deal of ignorance when we discuss the separation of church and state and religion and politics. But I'd like to add to Russell Kirk and suggest that there is hypocrisy that enters into some of this debate. May I read to you a segment of a letter that appeared in the New York Diocesan newspaper, Catholic New York, on July 7th, 1983. As an American and a Catholic, I am proud of you. It would have been easy to compromise your position so as to offend no one. You chose instead to tend to your duties as shepherds, to teach the moral law as best you can. You can do no more. Our church has sometimes been accused of not having spoken out when it might have. Now you, our bishops, show the courage and moral judgment to meet this issue of nuclear holocaust with a collective expression of where the church in America stands. And of course, the letter writer was referring to the Catholic bishop's letter about nuclear weapons and defensive systems and so on. That letter was signed by the governor of New York, Mario Cuomo, who strangely 1 year later at San Francisco at the Democratic National Convention and subsequently has made it extremely clear that religious views, at least when it comes to the issue of abortion, should have no part in the political debate. Funny, a year earlier, religious views were to be applauded when they were on a subject of his choosing. There's a great deal of hypocrisy. But there is also honest debate, having recognized those two shortcomings. The intent of the framers of the Constitution and the founders of the nation may be discerned. James Madison, 3 days before the adoption of the Bill of Rights, voted for congressional chaplains for both houses of the U.S. Congress. In fact, he was one of 6 members of the committee who made the recommendation that there be paid chaplains for the U.S. Congress. And a day before the adoption of the Bill of Rights, joined Congress in voting to urge the President of the United States to proclaim a day of thanksgiving to Almighty God, and so on. He authored the Bill of Rights. Thomas Jefferson, as president in 1803, urged the passage of a treaty in the United States Senate for the benefit of the Kaskaskia Indians, in which federal money would have been used to build a Catholic church in which they would worship and pay the salary of a priest to minister to them. Now that violates my understanding of separation of church and state, but that was the action of Thomas Jefferson, who contrived the phrase, wall of separation between church and state. 10 years later. Entering this debate as the first item in the fine address of Charles Rice was the recent debate between the Attorney General Edwin Meese and Justice William Brennan of the Supreme Court, in which Brennan alleges it is the height of arrogance to go back to the intent, to think we can discern the intent of the founding fathers and those who drew up the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and that we should be a free-floating court to decide whatever is right today. And I suggest it to be the height of arrogance, because even when Brennan did not have to guess or try to tease out the intent of those framers, even when he knew what it was, as in the case of Madison and paid congressional chaplains, he was willing in the case of Marsh versus Chambers to say that it was improper for the state of Nebraska to have a paid legislative chaplain to open the daily sessions of that Senate in prayer. Even when he knew the vote of the man who wrote the First Amendment, Brennan was willing to say, knowing the intent, I discard it. And thus we are left with a court today, unanchored in history, which sees itself somehow when the philosophy of judicial activism or non-interventionism, that is, non-interpretivism, that is, the courts are not limited to interpreting the Constitution, sees itself as a kind of broom sweeping away the detritus of outmoded attitudes and beliefs, outmoded in their view. I rather take heart that there was, and that was a minority decision, incidentally, I rather take heart with the judgment of Justice Rehnquist, again a minority dissent, in the Jaffrey silent prayer case in Alabama, when he asserts that the court over the years has erroneously interpreted the true meaning of the First Amendment's ban on establishing religion. The modern line of rulings began with the 47 case of Everson versus Board of Education, in which the court outlined the concept of a wall of separation between church and state. And in that case, by the way, the court added the adjectives high and impregnable to the concept of wall of separation. The wall of separation, says Justice Rehnquist, between church and state is a metaphor based on bad history, a metaphor which has proved useless as a guide to judging. It should be frankly and explicitly abandoned. Now, I express approbation, but I agree with the concept of separation of church and state as historically understood, not as developed since 1947, and contradicted even by the United States Congress. In 1954, after that 47 declaration of a high and impregnable wall of separation, the Congress of the United States added to the words of the pledge to the flag the phrase, under God. And Chief Justice Berger, in his dissent in the Jaffrey silent prayer case, wondered aloud what secular purpose, one of the tests for establishment of religion, what secular purpose there was in the Congress's adding the words, under God, to the pledge to the flag. Let me suggest to you, following Russell Kirk's admonition, that we who are religious leaders not consider ourselves to be experts in areas where we lack expertise, where prudential judgment is in fact the order of the day, and where we make pronouncements presumably because we sit on some spiritual high ground. But following his admonition, let me suggest an agenda that I have been laying out to evangelicals in the last year or so of 5 values in which religious people can make a unique contribution. They're in the areas of social issues. We could talk about economics, we could talk about international issues, defense, and that sort of thing, but I choose not to do that, but to talk about 5 sets of values. I only list them. A, retention of religious liberty. B, recognition of God in public life. C, protection of the sanctity of life. D, preservation of the traditional family. And E, the restoration of Judeo-Christian values to education and legislation. Notice that these are principles rather than policies. I would assume that all of us agree with the principle that it is a serious moral issue that we are having annual deficits in federal spending with a burgeoning national debt. The NAE has declared that that's a moral issue and has called upon the President and the Congress of the United States to get serious and to deal with it. But there's a difference between that principle and policies. When it comes to policy, NAE did not specify how to carry that out, whether simply to do it by cutting spending or to do it by increasing taxes or a combination of both. Thus, the difference between policies on which even evangelicals with the same commitment to the scriptures may differ, and principles on which I should hope we could develop a common agenda. And by the way, when it comes to all of these, don't knuckle under to that bromide, which is recited as if one of the 10 Commandments, that you cannot legislate morality. We do it all the time, whether by a 55-mile-an-hour national speed limit, or the existence of a Social Security system, or the civil rights movement. How fascinating that we legislated morality, and I applaud it. We did the right thing. In fact, we legislated theological morality because we based the civil rights laws on the conviction that all men and women are created equal, much more than a mere political statement. we legislate morality all the time. At bottom, Christians agree with Falwell and Hatfield that we have more to fear from the wrath of a holy God who judges nations than from the Soviet Union, or for that matter, any combination of nations on the face of the earth. We understand that God's commands are for our good, and thus, within the political structures of a representative government, a democratic republic, we work for values that will be for the good of our neighbors, the better way to live, under the standards revealed in the Scriptures, though we find other ways to argue for them than going into the legislatures and the Congress waving our Bibles around. When we do it, we will make a grievous mistake if our involvement in politics is primarily institutional. Let it be individual. Individual Christian involvement, religious involvement in politics, not institutional involvement. Then nobody can lay a glove on us. Not the media, not even a constitutional scholar. We need to get our salt out of the shaker. We are the salt of the earth on the authority of our Lord and Savior. And we must get that salt out of the shaker and into the political decision-making process for the good of the nation and ultimately for the glory of God.
Thank you very much, Dugan. Now for our final comments before we give you a chance on this. Pleasure to present Magruder.
Thank you, Cliff. I was thinking of a theological principle that is in the Bible according to Magruder, which is a new Bible that I'm going to produce soon, which is that the game isn't over until it's over. And I was thinking of that today when I came up here because in 1963, Cliff White was campaign manager for Barry Goldwater, who was running for president at that time. And I think I was a young kid then, and I feel like I was. I think I was. And I was running Northern Illinois for Goldwater, and I met Cliff White, and Cliff was this guru who I had always admired. In 1972, Cliff and I worked together in the Nixon campaign. The unfortunate part of that was that when I hired Gordon Liddy, I didn't assign him to Cliff White. Gordon Liddy continued to work for me, and that was my downfall. It just showed that Cliff was always the guru I thought he had been. He was smart enough to stay out of it. And here we are 10 or so years later, and I haven't seen Cliff since that time until tonight. And now I'm a Presbyterian minister serving in Columbus, and Cliff is still a guru. And so I would just suggest to all of you, particularly those of you who are my age, and I see some of you I think are my age, that's over 30, is that the game isn't over until it's over. So there's always hope. I think that's a good theological principle. On the issues that we heard about and listened to, I guess, it seems to me that religion is much broader than has been defined, particularly by the second speaker, Cal Thomas. It seems to me that we have a tendency to want to define religion and our faith as Christians in moral terms, and it certainly is moral, and morality is part of our religion. But I would like to suggest that we need to broaden that definition, and that if we are people of faith, that we need to consider peace, we need to consider justice, we need to consider equality, and we need to consider many other issues that are biblical in nature and that are true, that encompass more than the simple issues of morality, whether it's abortion, pornography, which I think are very important issues. And I do not want to negate the importance of those issues in our society. But I would like to suggest that we as Christians and we as people of faith need to consider the whole biblical text. And I think the whole biblical text is much broader than simple moral issues. Secondly, it seems to me that, let me get my glasses on to be sure I know what I wrote down here, that politics and religion are inexorably intertwined. And that we as people, and I think Bob is inferring this, have to, as Christians, as Jews, as Muslims, or whatever our faith might be, have to be involved in the process of government if we are to retain our democracy. And so to me, it isn't a question of do they belong together? They are together. They are together if we are a democracy founded under God and have an understanding that we believe that there is some supreme being beyond ourselves. And therefore, as individuals, we have no choice but to be involved in the political process. We can't deny it. We can't avoid it. If we avoid it, we then can come to the point where our country, I think, can be threatened as a viable democracy in a world that is in conflict. So I would hope that we would understand that as church people, as members of an individual church, an individual denomination, does not exclude us from the life of politics, and that there is nothing theologically or nothing politically in our democracy that separates us. There may be laws, there may be Supreme Court decisions. To me, that has nothing to do with the fact that we as individuals have to be involved, and that the biblical principles force us to be involved, that we can't separate politics from religion. And the third point, I think, is that it's not important to me, it is important to me personally, what position I take. It isn't important to me what position you take, other than that you take the position seriously. It can be a liberal position, could be a conservative position. What I would hope we would do is take positions, that we as Christians understand that it is important to take positions on issues. The Bible certainly gives us guidelines, and I have my positions as a Presbyterian minister, as someone who has been involved in politics and has gone into the ministry, and I have my positions which I will speak from in the pulpit and teach from when I have that opportunity. I'm not particularly concerned, in a sense, what position we take. What I'm really concerned is that we take a position. Because we can argue, and I think we can all argue legitimately about different theological concepts. And each one of us can take a verse in the Bible or a concept theologically and come up on both sides of it. I think that's a fact of religion. It's a fact of our faith that not one of us, if we are asked to define Jesus Christ individually, will come up with the same answer. Each one of us will define it somewhat differently. So I would hope that we would be involved in issues. As far as the church is concerned, I think the church has to be careful about getting involved specifically in candidates. So I, as a minister, would not from the pulpit endorse a candidate. Rather, I would discuss issues. And I would hope that we would allow each one of us in our own way to discuss issues, whether they would always coincide, and many times they will not coincide. And so it's not important to me whether we take a liberal position or a conservative position, but rather that we take a position that's based on understanding of our own theology, of an understanding of the Bible, and an understanding of this country. So I would hope that we would not separate politics and religion, and with that I would hope we would go on with the discussion.
Thank you, Jeb. We've had first a review from 3 speakers throughout the fall. Now we've had comments from these distinguished people here as to their interpretation of this question of politics and religion, a basic and fundamental question. I now encourage you to participate in this discussion, those of you who are in the audience, as well as the members of the panel. I would like to make this become a discussion and a dialogue. My difficulty is going to be overcoming the way you have been structured by the media to listen to panels and ask questions and make everybody respond, to that question. We're interested in seeking for information here and people's judgments and inputs in regard to this basic question. Anyone on the panel want to take any issue with anybody else on the panel at this point, or elaborate on any points?
Yes, I would like to take a little issue with my new friend, Jeb Stuart Magruder. Read his book and profited greatly and enjoyed it immensely some time back. I told him I should have reread it in coming out here knowing that I'd be meeting him. But in his comment that he really doesn't isn't concerned what position you take as long as you take a position. I wonder, I'd like to press him and see if he really means that. Is any position in politics as good as any other simply because you take it and have thought it through? That certainly doesn't pertain in religion, I would assume. One would presume that to be a Presbyterian or a Scientologist is not an immaterial distinction. So I assume that he would press for the Christian faith as opposed to others, and I know that he has his own political views. When I suggest that maybe he's overstated, he really doesn't care what positions people hold. I say that and recognize full well that evangelicals are going to differ with each other. That doesn't surprise me whatsoever. If we differ with each other on things taught in the Scriptures, we who have an equally high view of the Scriptures, such as baptism, who should be baptized and how, when that subject is taught, all the more will we differ with each other on subjects not stipulated in the Scriptures, political issues. But I'd just like to challenge him a little bit and hope he'd back down. On an issue like the sanctity of life and so forth, for example, there's room for a little difference in some of the policy matters, but I see that as a transcendent moral issue on which I would like to think that people who are truly biblical would agree in principle.
Well, let me make it perfectly clear. I hoped I had included that the issues that we could dialogue on would be premised on an understanding of the Christian faith. Obviously, I'm not talking about that I would accept, an opinion over here that comes from an atheist position versus a Christian position. What I hope I meant was within the Christian position on any number of issues, I think there are legitimate differences that we can interpret biblical truth to some extent differently, and that if we deal with, as example, the Holy Spirit, I think the Holy Spirit may mean something to me that may be different to you, Bob. And I would hate to say that the only way you are going to achieve salvation, as an example, is if you understand John 3:16 the way I understand John 3:16. Well, some people understand John 3:16 differently than I do, and I say, yeah, that's fine. If we were all coming to the same place, we still believe and understand that Jesus Christ is our primary means of salvation, but how we interpret that and how we live that, I think, is different for many of us as Christians, and I would hope we'd always allow that kind of breadth of understanding so that we can dialogue. And I won't comment on abortion.
Are there any political positions that would be out of court for, say, a Christian church to hold?
Well, yeah, as an example, authoritarian. I mean, it's unfortunate that the Christian church in Nazi Germany in the 30s was unable to deal with the issue of authoritarian kind of leadership that was exemplified by Adolf Hitler. And the Christian church, the German church, failed, except for the small part of what became the confessing church. Unfortunately accepted Romans 8, you see, that we should, as Paul said, follow the civil authorities, and so the German church said, yes, we'll follow the authority even if it's Adolf Hitler. I think that was an unfortunate interpretation of the Bible. They were Christian, but they interpreted it incorrectly.
Yes.
Bringing up that idea, you say you were opposed to, for example, opposing any political candidate or his ideas. Is that correct? Or are you just opposing his candidacy? Or
No, I was simply saying, as a minister, I think we have to be very careful when, from the pulpit, I think we should talk about issues, not candidates.
Okay,
well, go ahead. You're going to kind of...
The point of, for example, if it would have been righteous for the churchmen of Nazi Germany to oppose Hitler from the pulpit, or as clearly as they could, which their best platform was the pulpit,
Yeah.
why wouldn't it be appropriate for Christian ministers to oppose candidates who advocated abortion on demand and other issues? Their positions were somewhat repugnant to other Christians.
I think that's a good point, and I think there is a narrow line there as to when do you go in.
I think the line, I think what you have to keep in mind, you have to be very careful, and this is part of the difficulty, and this is part of why we have tried to create this whole discussion. And we have phrased throughout all of this, if you will remember the discussion, the relationship, the second lecture was essentially a relationship on the institutional church versus the relationship of the institutional politics. The problem with using an institutional position from which to speak is that there is implied that this is an institutional position. And I think what every one of the speakers up here has said, including which Bob Dugan was saying, within the evangelical group or within group A or B or C, there are differences in regard to an implementation, which is a legislative program, legitimate differences that may exist as an individual citizen. And I think this is what Jeb was saying. As an individual citizen, you not only have a right, but you have a responsibility to speak. Now, we play the game in American public life today of getting up today and on all of our great big commercials and ads saying, signing off a disclaimer. This does not represent the position of General Motors. But why did you put that in there? So that everybody knew you were president of General Motors, and therefore everybody then tends to want to come in and assume that that is a General Motors position. Part of the problem, I think, of the question of church and politics is this question of the institutional relationships between the two of them. Now I think you come back to a much more basic point, which is what, again, all of the speakers mentioned, and which I think we ought to consider and address ourselves, is, are there any basic moral values? Are there any basic fundamentals? And if so, aren't those fundamentals the things that ought to be proposed, promoted, advocated, fought for, died for, and all the rest? Those are basic moral values. Now, you can get into all kinds of trouble, and you do all the while, in what becomes then the implementation. How do you achieve this moral goal? The suggestion that Democrats or Republicans, either one, like to deprive people of anything is a false statement, in my opinion. It's just that there is a difference of opinion between Republicans and Democrats that in regard to a governmental, i.e. an institutional role of how to provide a better life for people. So, this is the complexity of the situation, I think, and I think this is part of what Jeb was getting at, and I think what Jeb was saying is, as individuals, we all have a responsibility in that. You want to argue that point or comment on it further?
I agree that I'd just like to say, in politics today, there are PACs, there are many institutional groups which are exerting their particular interests within the political system, okay? There is no reason whatsoever for us to say, well, the institutional church can't do that. This particular denomination dare not come out and say, well, the Roman Catholic bishop did come out and say this. I think that's not to be prescribed. I don't think that's wrong.
Fine, okay. I think that's a perfectly valid position, and I'm delighted to have you state it.
I think that, I agree with the church taking positions on issues like the Roman Catholic Church did and has, and I'm glad they have.
Yeah, when I spoke of the individual involvement, I was talking the involvement in politics, working for candidates and so forth. That's what I meant by that. If it wasn't clear on issues, we're free to do what we wish. But the IRS...
All right, but get back here now to a minute, though. The question I was raising. My dear old friend Jim Buckley always said there was something, what he called and these people have heard me say it before, Jim said there were the eternal verities. I never made him list them all for me, because I'm not sure he could have. But to him, there were those eternal verities. And those were essential and should be practiced by government, church, economic systems, and everything else. Are there such things? And is that what we mean when we talk about having religion and politics interrelate? I'm asking all of you on the panel. I'm asking all of you.
I think there are, but we have moved today into what John Whitehead calls sociological law, and that's the problem with the Supreme Court, because it is now saying whatever the court says it is, that's our absolute for today. So that once was evil. It would have been an insult to call a medical doctor an abortionist because everybody knew he'd signed the Hippocratic Oath and was committed to preserve life, and now we have legislated to where that is legal and therefore considered to be moral by the great bulk of the American people. That's a mistaken connection, that what is legal is necessarily moral, to be sure. But with sociological law, unanchored in absolutes, the Blackstone's commentaries are no longer studied by students of law. You go into the library and the archives to look at those. Blackstone argued that English common law was based on the foundational law of the scriptures and its moral absolutes. That's no longer the case for lawyers today.
No, now you quote Gunnar Myrdal in the Supreme Court decision. Who, for those who don't know, is a Swedish sociologist, most recently an economist. He went from sociology to economist. Sorry, I don't have any of the economics department here tonight, do I? Argue that point with them, whether there's any difference between sociology and economics. They're both mystical sciences that have no absolutes.
Economics
well,
is the bottom line.
I think we're dealing right now, and I don't know whether we got you overwhelmed, and that's why they all were caught, with the real basic essence of this question of church and religion. And we've come close. We've played with this question now of the institution. We've moved back a little bit. We've said, you know, maybe the institution has a right to say something. What does it have a right to say then? And also, what about the question of which every one of the panelists has made, I think, and if I'm misinterpreting them, I hope they will correct me, has said, I think the essence, one thing they said in common was every individual does have a responsibility here for, I would guess, promoting and articulating their moral values for the society.
Well, Cliff, I would like to extend that to more than moral values, because I think if we concentrate only on moral values, we miss peace and justice and equality. And
those are moral values.
Yes, sir.
Well, I'd like...
I have a feeling, though, that we're avoiding an issue that our good young friend brought to us here. That's this question. If we maintain that it was right, or that it would rather have been right, for the church in Germany to speak to Hitler, then on what basis do we say we should avoid it here? For the church to speak against a presidential candidate who recommends abortion across the borders?
Yeah, I think that's a very sound. That's why I said I thought we had come to the basic question here, particularly from the institutional point of view. Now, I don't know whether anybody else wants to comment. Would you like to comment on my statement on that, of the presumption of an institution speaking for all members of that institution?
I would like you to offer Jeff speak to that out of the kinds of presentations which they're saying.
Okay. Would you care first? Yeah.
Go ahead, Bob.
For one thing, at the question of legality and so forth, what we're guided by, unfortunately, is a ruling of the Internal Revenue Service that says that 501c3 organizations, to maintain not only their tax-exempt status, but to be able to give a receipt for a contribution that allows you to deduct it as a charitable contribution, to maintain that, we're deprived of the right directly to engage in seeking to influence the outcome of an election. Now, we can do it indirectly. We can advocate positions, and if people say, well, there are those 5 important issues, and this particular candidate matches 4 of them, the other only matches 1 of them, why, it's logical then, but that's an indirect influence, and that's okay. But to keep our tax deductible, our status where our contributions can keep flowing in and get tax deduction, we abide by that, but that's never really been tested in the courts so far as I know. And there are those who think that one day it ought to be, and that it could well be argued that religious groups are deprived of their free expression of their religion, free exercise or freedom of speech and so forth. But there have been a lot of cases where religious speech has been discriminated against. It required equal access legislation and a decision of the Supreme Court to give that kind of religious speech the privilege of being exercised in universities, and now equal access law for high school students and so forth. At the spiritual level, all of us who are in leadership of churches, denominations, or whatever, ought to be more concerned about the unity of the body of Christ spiritually than about our political clout and so forth. And so it becomes oftentimes prudential not to make ourselves out to be partisan persons and thus split the body of Christ. And that's very critical. That's top priority. So keeping ourselves issue-oriented and not party-oriented and not politician-oriented is always a good approach there, I think. A prudential approach for the sake of the body of Christ. So I approach it from those two perspectives.
Well, and I think there's another alternative, though, available, and it was actually suggested by a young man over here when he said that where a lot of PACs had been created and were arguing for putting special pressure on politics. There is nothing in the world that prevents any group associated and initially associated with a church or anything else from creating their own special interest group and doing anything they want to, proclaiming it, raising money, spending money, getting candidates or anything else. So that is an alternative, which in a way helps overcome the concern that Bob has, which I think is a legitimate concern, of breaking up the church itself into factions and therefore weakening the church. A second point, which I think is worthy of serious consideration, is a point that Bob Dugan made in his original speech, and that was that in regard to what are essentially, in most instances, political and governmental questions, and we can spend some time going back and arguing about moral questions and others, but in regard to many political and governmental questions which deal with the implementation of action to achieve a desirable goal, there is no evidence that because you are a member of a church or a member of a clergy that you have any knowledge or information that particularly qualifies you to make judgments in that area. My own particular church is running off making all kinds of judgments today. And happens that my young associate minister was a commissioner at the National Convention this last time. And she made very profound pronouncements in regard to foreign policy, and I have no evidence whatsoever, even from talking to her or looking at her educational background or anything else, that she knows one gol darn thing about foreign policy. Now, if she wanted to make it a moral issue, fine, and I would support the legitimacy, but I sure as the devil, you know, I spent 60 years of my life trying to understand a couple of these foreign policy issues she made a judgment on, and I still struggle with a decision to be made, and she's already made a very fundamental decision for me. That I object to in the back.
One thing, I agree with that, but I think one of the things that when you say that kind of thing that you're ignoring is the fact that we are deferring this, and the people that are making these decisions are the media and representatives of the media, who, in my opinion, are no better qualified, probably less qualified than the person that you're referring to.
You're darn right. I agree with you totally.
This is why I feel that sometimes it's sort of a cop-out when you say, well, I'll speak to it on an individual basis as opposed to speaking to it on an institutional basis, because I feel that those things need to be done, and speaking as an individual doesn't carry nearly the weight that you would if you were speaking in your position before the group of people that you were happen to be speaking before.
Well, somebody have another comment?
I'd like to respond to that.
Okay.
I'd like to say that the individual input that is not perceived as orchestrated is going to be a whole lot more effective in changing national policy than is a series of institutional pronouncements. If Jerry Falwell comes to the east front of the U.S. Capitol and holds a press conference, all the liberal members of Congress say, oh yeah, Falwell again. I could have told you what his position was before he came. The National Council of Churches makes a pronouncement. Conservative members of Congress say, oh yeah, the NCC again. Yeah, I know they're tight. That really doesn't change anything. But if religious people learn how to communicate with the people who represent them, the only people in the U.S. Congress who have to care what you think are the 2 U.S. senators from your state and the 1 representative from the district in which you live, the 1 representative in the U.S. House. The others really don't have to care what you think, because you'll not either retain them or reject them next election.
I'd like, if I could, to jump back into this. There's a view that's been stated twice that I disagree with. I disagreed with it in my summary. And this distinction between principle and policy, I think you put forward that distinction. Yeah. And then you have put it forward as the difference between the eternal verities, whatever they are, and implementation. Grant your example that often people in the church speak ex cathedra, as if from the authority of God, about things that they have little knowledge of. I think, though, that we've maybe made that a bit of a scarecrow, And I'm not sure that that dichotomy absolutely holds up. For example, you may have moral principles, and how you go about applying those moral principles may also be a moral issue, because the way we apply our moral principles often affects people, and that makes it a moral issue. I'm just not sure we can draw the line that sharply between having principles and then letting somebody else do the implementation. In fact, what I think may be the case is that if people in the church have their principles down but don't understand the issues surrounding implementation, then they need to find out about the foreign policy issues. Whereas I'm afraid that the distinction that you're making and Mr. Dugan is making tends to scare church people away from getting into practical applications. And that's what kept the church out of politics for so long. And I think that's dangerous. I mean, we say, oh, I don't know anything about foreign politics, so I better stay out of it and let the experts deal with that, and I'll just stick to these vague, abstract moral principles that we talk about in church on Sunday. Well, nobody's going to change anything if you have that attitude.
Well, I think you make a very sound point. Certainly, I don't think either Bob or I had any intention of suggesting that. I mean, we spend all our time trying to get people to get informed and get involved in the decision-making process. But there is the question of the institutional relationship. We got a couple of comments here.
I think there's a still more awkward dimension to what I think I heard you saying, Doug, and what I think I heard Mr. White say a little earlier. That is that there have been profoundly important moral issues at stake. Some of the positions that our government has taken in various international politics, having to do with the support of certain regimes, for reasons that in many instances seem to be supporting the economic welfare of our own economy, trade policies and so on, where we have supported persons where it seems to me to have been clearly immoral and desperately wrong practices being perpetuated by that. Talking now about some instances in Southeast Asia, in Central America, and other places, granting at the same time, Mr. White, that in every instance those have been terribly complex matters that I don't comprehend, but if we're implying that there are not moral issues at that level, which the Christian conscience needs to address, then I think we're seriously.
See, I think the Christian conscience needs to address it, and that's the whole point. And I think that's a very basic point. I think it needs to be addressed. I think it needs to be addressed in those terms. I think that we make a mistake, and we make a serious mistake in a good deal of our public dialogue by trying to eliminate any dialogue in regard to the morality and the moral issues that are the moral factors that are involved in a particular given issue. I think we need desperately that kind of discussion and dialogue to come to a resolution. I don't know absolutely that any decision I have ever made was the one the good Lord would have made had he been here to make it. I hope and pray that it is, and I work at trying to get to that point, but I don't take those positions with any degree whatsoever of surety in the absolute of it. I am always strengthened when I can engage in a dialogue with somebody else about the morality of a particular issue and position, because it helps me to clarify and think through my own position more fully. So I think we need that. Again, I think one of the dangers we run into, and I think this is one of the problems we get into in the whole issue of politics, is the people who then proclaim that theirs is the true word, and there is no opportunity for any dialogue or discussion as to whether theirs is the true word or not, but make them accept it as a moral issue.
But in fairness, I must suspicion that the lady you identified as some denomination official may have been trying to address some of those kinds of issues within the limits of the information that was available to her. And if so, she may have been entirely in order.
Well, she may have been in order, except that I would push her one point further. I think if that's what she wanted to do, she ought to be willing to engage in a dialogue with people who do have information about that. And in her particular case, I happen to be a member of her congregation. And I'm available for dialogue on anything, anywhere, as you people well know. Yeah.
One of the, I see, I'd like your response to that. We've thrown around issues like sanctity of human life, and we've had the abortion issue mentioned a few times. One of the problems that we seem to have is we throw that term around and there's no definition. We've got Christian leaders who call themselves pro-life and then jump on the abortion bandwagon, but say virtually nothing about poverty. That's a life issue. Or it can be the other way around. We seem to be involved a lot of times in one-issue politics. We will accept or reject a candidate based on one, maybe two issues, instead of going across the board and seeing life, as was mentioned, economic practices in other parts of the world. Don't we need to sit down and start discussing it? And also, in response to some things that you said, peace and justice are moral issues. If we ever separate theology from ethics, we might as well just go all in because forget it.
Well, yeah. Let me just respond because Bob mentioned certainly peace and justice, by the way, are moral issues. And but what has happened, and I would disagree with the tendency of people, as an example associated with Reverend Falwell, to limit those issues to those 3 or 4 or 5 issues that tend to be what I would call very trigger-type issues, and not to include peace, justice, equality, the whole of the biblical truth, not the narrow of the biblical truth.
We have talked, we call ourselves pro-life, but then we'll hit one issue, maybe 2 or 3, and then we have ignored other life issues.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, we have to be careful when we define morality as being only pornography, abortion, and so on.
Interestingly, if I may build on that, that's why NAE has a Peace, Freedom, and Security Studies program underway, and I think we're plowing some fresh ground that other religious groups are not plowing. Each word in the title, by the way, is important: peace, freedom, security. All 3, not any one without the other 2. But Jerry Falwell doesn't limit himself to 2 or 3 trigger issues. And he may be an illustration of what was expressed as a concern over here because he didn't learn from having only 5 days in South Africa and announcing that Bishop Tutu was a phony and so forth, but he only spent 2 days in the Philippines. He visited President Marcos and his wife, and I guess that way got both sides of the issue, the men's and the women's side or something. And then announced that the U.S. government should quit its belly aching and support the Philippines. And at that point, Falwell relinquished his moral authority as a man of God and put it strictly on the basis of the self-interest of the United States for its military bases, its Air Force base and its naval base in the Philippines, which is a legitimate political position, but he expressed no concern about the corruption in the Philippine government. And at that point, the U.S. State Department was taking a higher moral stance than Jerry Falwell, who has now branched out into just about every area of expertise. And I think that's what we want to avoid, is somehow seeming that as spiritual leaders, we know it all. And that's tragic, that the U.S. State Department is more concerned about the corruption there, nor does Falwell express any awareness that communism can take root in certain kinds of soil. And when there's a great deal of corruption and abuse and denial of justice, that's a great ground for the seeds of communism to sprout forth. So he's gone beyond those other issues. Maybe if he'd gone back to them, he'd been on safer ground.
Well, just to be can I be contentious? Just to be contentious. Sure. In a sense, you see, I disagree with Jerry Falwell, but I do really feel that he has a right to say what he said. I don't agree with it, but I think he does have a right as an individual and as a Christian. I happen to disagree with his Christian principles, the way he interprets them, but I think he has a right. And I would also say, Cliff, just to be contentious with you, that so does your Presbyterian. I know she's Presbyterian because I know Cliff's a Presbyterian, and as a Presbyterian minister, I know what those people are doing, and I would ratify her right to take that position, even though I know you would disagree with it, because I think
I don't
they're
disagree.
both sides.
See, the point I make, and we want to carry this because I got a couple of other people over here. I don't have any problem at all with her taking that position. What I objected to was her taking that position and taking with that position the authority to subscribe that position to the institution of the church, which I happen to be a part of.
Of course, you know as a good Presbyterian that you gave up that right when you became a member of the church because of the polity of the Presbyterian church.
No, I didn't. That's a question over here.
Listening to the comments that have gone on, I see a trend in the conversation which seems to follow the normal pattern. That first off, we start talking about the broad issues of Christian versus non-Christian, then it comes down to Christian versus Christian position. And I see only a solution for the problem of religion and politics. I admit I like only single solutions because they're easier to understand. But it seems that we have two choices that we must pursue both. Christians must become involved in politics. We have separated Christian belief and politics within our individual lives to a large extent to where it has become a life pattern. And so if Christians don't run for office because of this concept of separating my Christianity from my way of life, and putting them into two separate compartments, we cannot influence the political scene. We cannot change the moral stance when we divorce ourselves from the action. Secondly, it seems that we again underscore the failure of the church to keep up with the lifestyle of the country. Our Constitution may have been founded based on Christian principles, but the country has moved as a whole away from it because the church has not kept up with the evangelism procedures and whatnot that are prescribed in Christian tradition to keep us as a majority membership within the country. And so I think that not only must we participate in politics, but it really underscores the fact that we better get out there and make sure we talk to all people in this country about Christian belief and Christian conversion. Because we can do the legislating. You say we can legislate morality. I take some issue with that. I think we can legislate as a parallel to having an internal position and therefore get around the problem by passing laws that say that you must behave this way. But I don't think that addresses the issue, because without the internal position, the law merely addresses that instance, and we're never going to write enough laws to cover all instances. So we can legislate parts, but I don't think we can legislate morality. But we must get out and do the work that Christians are supposed to be doing all along.
Thank you. Any other comments here? Any of the panelists want to take one more crack at any point they were making, or if they dare risk having me make the 2-minute summary to conclude this whole affair this evening? Any of you have any? Okay.
I'd like to.
I've got them intimidated. Go ahead.
I thought maybe Doug was going to. You want to take a shot? Go ahead.
I'd just like to make one remark in response to Peter's comment. I'm not sure, again, that simply evangelizing the people of America will do the job. I wonder if the Christian church itself has not had a broad enough vision of what life should be like. And I think that perhaps many of the problems of our country, if not originated in the church, certainly took root there. And I just wonder if, okay, we get these people evangelized, we get them attending church, still, what kind of lifestyle, what kind of, as you said, life patterns do we talk about with them? Maybe we've had too narrow a view of the Christian life, not only in the sense of excluding politics, but in excluding other questions about the way we live. Again, I would express a concern about the consumer society that we live in which we find pleasure in very superficial and base kinds of things. And I wonder about the long-term effect of that on the environment and on our own souls. And those kinds of issues maybe have not been effectively raised in the Christian church, so that evangelism isn't enough. Maybe we also need to talk about what is a Christian culture, or what is a good culture in general.
Thank you.
And I'd like to affirm the last speaker in his emphasis upon the proclamation of the gospel and so on. I could develop our biblical responsibility from the perspective of the cultural mandate of Genesis 1, of the kingdom mandate of our Lord, the great theme of the Synoptic Gospels, of the analogical mandate of light and salt and so on. Could do it in a lot of different ways. And when we fulfill the spiritual role of our church and proclaim the Word of God in faithfulness and apply it as broadly as we can. Back in my days of ministry in Elmhurst, Illinois, in a practically totally white suburban community, our people were 90% in favor, in an anonymous survey, the people of the First Baptist Church of Elmhurst were 90% in favor of fair housing legislation when the community was absolutely 50-50. And that was because I simply was not satisfied to say God is a just God, therefore we must be just, but to say one of the applications of justice is that we must allow people to purchase a house next door to us if they care to do so, whatever the color of their skin, etc., etc. When we proclaim the Word of God and apply it fully, among other things, we will be announcing the criteria by which the God of the nations judges nations. And the public's not going to learn that from the politicians. Our people have to understand those standards and those criteria, and they will talk them. And then political change can come from the bottom up. The public sentiment will be changed, as Abraham Lincoln put it. It took decades upon decades to change the public sentiment on the issue of slavery, but eventually it changed. And so my formula has been, and it's been honored in the breach at one end or the other, that the church's role is a dual one. One, to transform society by the spiritual processes of evangelizing and equipping. The equipping, Doug, including the full education and all you're talking about, the way we live as Christians. But secondly, and parallel to it, to reform society through the political processes of educating and electing. The liberal churches, by and large, tend to give short shrift to the first one, the spiritual processes. The evangelical churches have tended to give short shrift to the second one, the political processes. It's not one or the other, of course. It's both and.
Anything?
I've said my full.
Okay,
full
thank you.
tonight.
I think what we have said, and we've been at this now all fall, and I think the two summaries that both Doug and Bob gave are true. And I think it goes back to the first lecture that Russell Kirk said. You know, religion, society's imperative. Religion, moral values, whatever you want to call them, those basic things, religion, have to be the basis. Now, I think within the two institutions of both the church and the political institutions, there are weaknesses in fulfilling that. I think the church needs to fulfill it institutionally. I think the members of the institutional church have to, within their church, as well as in other places, not only practice, but preach and teach the values that are expressed and interpreted through the Bible. I think that's the basic. As you do that, that then becomes the basis of society. Politics is merely trying to reflect what society is. The reason we have politics and government is to put together a set of rules so we can all live together, that we understand. And that's why we have a government. If men were angels, Madison, I think, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. As long as they aren't, we do. Therefore, I think what we have said, and I think if there is a conclusion to all of the remarks we've had here tonight and throughout this whole lecture, is that we do need this basic belief, this Christian belief, almost accepted here, as the basis of our society. And that means it becomes a total and permeating part of our society and should find its place and role, not just in politics, but in politics, the economic system, the social system, the family system, and all the rest.